far as what the role of African Americans being enlisted into the Union forces and emancipation. What role does that play in the Union winning the war? Yes, sir.
It was more so kind of like a psychological thing, whereas like now Southerners have to fear their slaves like rebelling even more, and like these people that they've considered like to a lesser degree than them, they're now fighting in a war and even losing.
It's a massively powerful psychological thing. Okay. Any other thoughts as to the role here that that enrolling African Americans into the military and emancipation will play in winning the war? Yeah.
The enlisting of African Americans in Union forces defeated the South's labor force, which provided profits to finance the South's war costs, and while also bolstering the North's military strength.
Okay. All right. So both of those hit on the enlistment side of the equation. Remember, it's a 1-2 punch. What's the first part of the punch? Yeah.
Well, the emancipation, like it initially treated slaves as contraband. It set the tone for the 13th Amendment.
Yeah. Okay. So set the tone for the 13th Amendment and freedom. And then just finally, yeah, Chris.
Well, since it gave a lot of the slaves a reason to run, because before they would still be slaves if they went to the north basically, unless they went to the Union Army basically. But after that, they were just emancipated if they went over, and then that made the South lose a major source of their food, and they're basically
Okay.
their entire thing is farming.
Absolutely. Okay, absolutely. And there's still one tiny thing that you didn't hit on that I want to make sure you get. So one last thing. Yeah.
It changed kind of the purpose of the war, and it made it more about slavery than it was before.
And what does that do for your cause? Did it weaken their cause for war, the justification of war, or did it strengthen the justification for war? Strengthen the American justification for war. Okay, so so today I was real ambitious. I'm going to have to cut. By giving you guys the extra day to have the test on Tuesday, it gave me one more day that I didn't have to cut so much out of the Civil War stuff I wanted to talk to you about. But I don't get to do that with 135, so oh well. But I was ambitious. I thought we would get into Reconstruction today, so but since we have 2 days, it's not that crucial that we get there. But our hopes is we do. Okay. For homework, what I would suggest is that if you've already read the Reconstruction chapter in the textbook, that you review that material by doing the chapter 15 in the cram book. Additionally, I gave you a review sheet for chapter 14 that has some of the important terms that you ought to know and understand. Got it? So, when last we met, we had the Emancipation Proclamation, which had fallen on the heels of the Battle of Antietam. And after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln had fired his top general, George G. McClellan. He didn't think that George G. McClellan was his guy. The problem is, he didn't really have a guy to replace him. The kind of the stable of Union generals was kind of piss poor. They were either the worst people in the class at West Point, or they were what we would call political generals, people that became generals mainly because of family connections. Not very good choices. So Abraham Lincoln, at this point in the war, is actually going to go to the Library of Congress and check out every book on military strategy that he can find. And he is going to be the one who kind of concocts what is our total war plan. And he's, in effect, now looking for a general who could possibly implement it. So I imagine that in the middle of the Oval Office, he had like this giant spinner like you have in Twister, and it had the faces of all these different possible generals on it, and the way that he chose, because he might as well have done it this way, was to just hit the spinner. Ambrose Burnside, come on down. It is your turn to play General of the Army of the Potomac. Now, the Army of the Potomac was the Eastern American Army. It's the one that will mainly end up having to face General Lee. So, obviously, you need your best player there. So, Lincoln chooses this guy by the name of Burnside, who is known for having these big mutton chop hairy things on the side of his face. Okay? And these big mutton choppy hairy things on the side of his face, people started saying, they started calling these things Burnsides. We now call them sideburns. Okay? We now call them sideburns. Anyway, when Burnside gets the notification you're in charge of the army, he says, oh dear, I don't think I can do this. And he turned out that he was exactly correct. He was not very good. And he gets slaughtered. His soldiers get slaughtered at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Okay. Question?
Oh, I was just going to ask if you was the one that
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, Abraham Lincoln goes back to his office. He goes, okay, I need a new general. So he goes to his spinner and he goes, Thomas Hooker, come on down. It is your turn to play General of the Army of the Potomac. Now, Thomas Hooker was known for surrounding himself with lovely young ladies that provided well services. And these young ladies were known as Hooker's girls, later simply as hookers. Anyway, okay?
So is this like
Anyway. But,
modern
yeah.
slang?
Yeah.
Could be in
Yeah,
production
yeah,
slang?
okay. Anyway. Hooker is beaten at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But an unfortunate incident happens for the Confederacy. Well after the battle is over, Stonewall Jackson is riding back from patrolling the lines. It was dark. There is confusion. Some say there was a miscommunication about a password. But for some reason or another, Jackson is shot by his own men. Yeah, oops. The general, oops, yeah, that's not a good one. If you accidentally shoot someone, the general, probably not the best one. This will do irreparable harm to Lee's army, because Lee counted on Jackson being the guy who would kind of have his back in almost every battle. When he had any sort of elaborate thing in a battle plan, the unit that he knew would be able to pull it off was Stonewall Jackson and the Stonewall Brigade. Well, they've now lost their leader. Lee says he has lost his right arm. For Lincoln, however, he still does not have a general. And so he is going to now replace General Hooker with a general by the name of George Meade. George Meade. And it is going to be Meade that is going to end up the general of the American Army in one of the most important battles of the entire war. In this battle, Meade is going to face Lee near a little old town called Lee decides once again it was time to go on the offensive. What was happening politically in the United States is there were peace movements developing throughout the North. In New York, a group called the Copperheads, who were against emancipation, were pushing to end the war. There was a group in Ohio that were pushing to end the war because their section of Ohio was dependent upon shipping goods down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River, and then out to market. And if the war continued, they would continue not to be able to ship their goods in the way that they were used to, and they would continue to not make money. And people hate not making money. So they believed that if we ended the war peacefully, they would get access to the Mississippi River again, and thus they'd start making money again. This area was known as the butternut region of Ohio. They were known for growing butternut squash. And so we sometimes call this peace movement, we call them the butternuts. Okay? You also had a movement in Pennsylvania. Now the peace movement in Pennsylvania is mixed. You had southern Pennsylvania where you had a lot of former slave owners that were basically pushing to end the war. You also have a very large population of Quakers in Pennsylvania who were pushing for an end to fighting. So this peace movement's out there. And Lee believes that if he can win in the North, it would give strength to this movement. Give strength to, let's just end this peacefully, negotiate it, let there be two countries. Allow this to happen. If he wins, maybe. So he marches his army into southern Pennsylvania. And he will meet up with Meade's 92,000 men just outside this little town of Gettysburg. And it turned out not to be the best possible placement for Lee. Because you see, Lee ends up kind of on the valley floor, whereas Meade controlled the hilltops. Now, y'all played King of the Mountain, right? All right. You never played King of the Mountain?
King of the Hill?
King of the Hill? Okay, it was King of the Mountain when this thing shrank since. Anyway, so in the game King of the Mountain, you're at the top, okay? And people who want to become King of the Mountain have to get you off the top to become King of the Mountain. Well, this is kind of what the Confederacy had to do with the Union in the Battle of Gettysburg. The United States had mainly the tops of the hills. They were mainly at the bottom. So they had to get the people off of the top of the hills, which, by the way, is the harder task. This was very un-Lee-like to have been put in a situation where he has the lesser hand. And so one of the questions that has always been intriguing to historians is, why Gettysburg? Why does it happen there? And there's two theories. Theory one is the shoe theory. You see, the Confederate Army is notoriously undersupplied. They had marched their feet through their boots. And any opportunity to get any sort of replacement stuff was always seized upon. And the story is, there was a rumor that there had been a huge shoe shipment that had been made to Gettysburg. And that a unit of Confederate soldiers was sent to go get those shoes. And they ran into a Union unit right there in Gettysburg. They start fighting one another, and voila, the Battle of Gettysburg. The problem with the shoe theory is, why were you there to begin with? Why were you near Gettysburg for you to be taking advantage of the shoe thing? So the second theory is the roads theory. And if you look at an aerial map of Pennsylvania, you'll find there's like 8 major thoroughfares that kind of go north, south, east, west, okay? And it turns out that because of the hills and the way things are shaped in that section of Pennsylvania, all 8 of these roads end up crossing or coming near Gettysburg. So however you were traveling, you ended up there. Whether it was roads, whether it was shoes. We now end up in a battle. And this battle is the bloodiest battle in American history. Okay? So Antietam was the bloodiest single day. Well, it was a 1-day battle. This is a 3-day battle. Okay? And if you add it all up, this is the single bloodiest, the most Americans who have ever died in a battle. Now there is a little bit of cheating here because no matter who dies in the battle, it's an American dying in the battle. Okay? Anyway, battle seesawed back and forth. Over the days, you could not tell who was really winning. Okay? Some days it seemed like like the Union had the advantage. Other days it seemed like the Confederacy. The 3-day battle is made up of mini battles, lots of mini little fights. One of the more famous little fights was the Battle of Little Round Top. Little Round Top was this tiny little hill, but had the Confederacy seized this hill, they would have had a bird's eye view of the entire valley, and they would have been able to reposition their forces in a better way, and they might have won the battle overall. The deciding moment was an attack that Lee orders. He tells one of his generals, a guy by the name of George Pickett, to make a headlong attack up one of the hills. We simply call it Pickett's Charge. And so it was one of those moments where all of these Confederate armies, they're running up this hill. And they will be crushed. Ironically, given the name of this general, we believe the reason why the Confederacy loses this battle is because of fences. Okay? And it's not where fences were. It's where fences were not. You see, over the 3 days of this battle, there had been all these fences throughout Gettysburg, many of which had been knocked over. Okay? And so you would look at the fence line, and all of a sudden there'd be a break. You look at the fence line, and then there would be a break. You'd look at the fence line, and then there would be a break. And so now imagine, you are the Confederacy, you are told, charge, take the hill. And you're running, okay, at this hill, okay? And you see in front of you a fence. Now, it's not a huge fence, okay? Any half-athletic person would be able to take their little palm and, do the scoot over thing, okay? But as you're running, okay, and you see a fence in front of you, and then you see a fence not in front of you, you see a break in the fence. Where do you naturally go? To the break in the fence. And is this an individual thing? Is it only one soldier who goes, oh, there's the break in the fence? Well, what happens probably pretty much overall? They all start going toward the breaks in the fences. And what ends up happening is the Union is up on the top of the hill, looking down at these funnels, okay, of Confederate soldiers. And where do they concentrate their fire?
On the brakes and the fence.
On the brakes and the fences. They crush the Confederate attack. We say that this breaks the back of the Confederacy. Some say that this is in effect where the Confederacy loses the war. They just don't know it yet. Okay? It's that big of a deal. Note that once again, it's going to be Lee who is losing. It's going to be Lee that is going to have to retreat after this battle. The single bloodiest battle in American history. But meanwhile, what is actually going to be the clincher that makes it so that the Union can win is they need that general. They need that person who's going to be in charge. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you Hiram Ulysses Grant. Yeah. Hiram Ulysses is one of those misfortunate people who has an argument happen between his parents. Daddy likes the name Hiram. It's a family name. The boy shall be named Hiram. Mama believes that Ulysses is a nice, powerful name, and she thinks his name should be Ulysses. And so basically at home, it depends on which parent was calling you. If Dad was calling, Hiram, get in here. If Mom was calling Ulysses, okay. And this was kind of a thing. But it's Mama who had a connection with a congressman that will help get Hiram Ulysses Grant enrolled into West Point. And when he arrives at West Point, what name does it say on the enrollment? Ulysses. And then it said S, Grant. Now, Grant had no idea what the S stood for because it was not his name. Eventually, he decided to go by his mother's maiden name there, Simpson. And so, in effect, renamed by West Point is Ulysses Simpson Grant. Anyway, at West Point, okay, back of the class, okay, he not good at school, except math genius, okay. Everywhere else, not so good, except math class, okay. In math class, he shined. In fact, his ultimate dream was to come back to West Point and teach, okay. He wanted to be Dr. No. Okay. So this very limited in kind of what his ambitions are. But then we have the Mexican War. And during the Mexican War, he served under Zachary Taylor, and much of his fighting style, what his fighting style to be will be very much in the image of Zachary Taylor. But during the Mexican War, something manifested itself. Grant's an alcoholic. And he's not, the all the time alcoholic. He's your binge drinker. He absolutely does not drink a drop except for when he does. And then he goes on a bender. His friends covered this up. They made it so that he didn't get in trouble in the army during the war. They covered for him. But after the war, he is stationed in Oregon. And his wife Julia thought, yuck, wet, cold, rainy Oregon. I want to go back to Kentucky and hang out with my family until you're done here. And being separated from his wife made Grant sad. And Grant drank more. And they couldn't cover it up. He gets kicked out of the army. He then tries his hand at various other things. He tries to become a farmer. He sucked as a farmer. He tried to run a store. Oh God, no. Okay, he was like reverse Midas. Everything he touched turned to. Okay, okay. Finally, Daddy felt sorry for him and gave him a job in the tanning business that the family owned. Then came the Civil War. When the Civil War began, he contacts the United States Army and says, "I'm here." And the United States Army says, "No, you're not." He wouldn't let him join. Finally, Mama uses her connections again, and gets him appointed to lead a volunteer unit out of Ohio. And it is with this unit that he starts to show that he got skills. Apparently, even though he can do nothing else in life except math, if you fire cannonballs over this guy's head, he goes all genius. In the middle of battle, he knew exactly what to do. Okay, it seemed like you had to have absolute chaos going on around him before he could actually think. Right? Lincoln will be told about this young rising star in the army in the West. And the army higher-ups will say, "Oh, no, no, no. We don't like this guy. He drinks. That's his reputation. We don't want him." And Lincoln would make jokes about it. Lincoln would say, "Find out what he's drinking and give it to my other generals." Lincoln will say, "I like this guy, he fights." You see, Abraham Lincoln had basically kind of discovered very early on that the fighting style of most of the generals that he had was kind of this old school, if you're a football fan, there's this one way of playing football called field position football, which is about basically kind of moving the ball back and forth with punts and whatnot until you finally get yourself in a position that you maybe can score. And this is kind of how the American Army fought. It was basically try and get yourself in a good position and try and fight General Lee. But who was the most awesome person at maneuvering his army and positioning his army? It was Lee. And so if you continue to play just maneuver, you're going to lose every time. Grant, okay, if the other generals were like, let's play with fencing swords, Grant was, let's take a broadsword and just kill you. He basically realized that the one advantage that the United States had over the South was the number of soldiers. And Grant was not opposed to using that advantage. But what does that mean? Does anyone know what that means? More deaths. If you're going to use your numbers as an advantage, that means you're going to get more people killed. Anyway, Grant will rise to fame with battles in which he captures two forts on the Tennessee River. One was Fort Henry, the other was Fort Donelson. Now, the Donelson one is particularly notable because going into this battle, as everybody's looking at Fort Donelson, they thought that it was going to be a very difficult fort to attack. But Grant noticed that the Tennessee River was running awful high. And he looks at the river and he realizes that it is running so high that if he put gunboats out onto the river, that the basic arc of the artillery that is fired from a gunboat would actually go over the walls of Fort Donelson. Math, that's good. Anyway, he sends the gunboats out into the river. They start raining down shells into the middle of Fort Donelson. And basically inside the fort, getting hit by artillery, they decide they can't sustain a fight. And they send a message out to Grant, what are your conditions for surrender? And Grant says they are unconditional. In other words, you get to say nothing, I get to say everything. And hence he gets the nickname, U.S. Grant, Unconditional Surrender Grant. He hits a little bump in the road, however, in April of 1862, when he barely wins a battle at Shiloh. What's notable about this battle is that on the first day of battle, he got his butt whooped. He was losing. He lost lots of men. And in a similar situation, most Union generals would go, retreat, get out of there. But not Grant. Grant goes down to the battlefield, figures out how he had everything positioned wrong, fixes it, and wins the battle the next day. This will create kind of a divided opinion about him. You have one group of people saying Grant the Butcher. Grant just basically allows so many soldiers to die. And then you have the other group that's saying Grant the Winner. He wins battles that everybody else loses. Grant will next lay siege to Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the last Confederate holding on the Mississippi River. Get Vicksburg, get the river. And for 7 weeks, Grant will lay siege. Surround the fort. Nothing goes out or in. Fire cannonballs, artillery at them every day. In those 7 weeks, the garrison there will start killing whatever they can find, their mules, eventually rats, to eat. To take cover from the artillery, they will start digging out caves and living in caves. And finally, on July 4th, 1863, they surrender to Grant. Yes?
Didn't the war start on July 4th?
That wasn't the start of the war. That was that announcement by Lincoln as to what the war was going to be. The war started in April of 1861. July 4th weekend was actually the very same weekend as the Battle of Gettysburg. These two battles, in effect, were happening simultaneously. And the Union wins both of them within 2 days. Lee retreats on July 3rd. Grant gets the surrender of Vicksburg on July 4th. Together, these victories, the Gettysburg victory and the Vicksburg victory, changed the course of the war. Turning point, if you're looking for that type of word. These victories will tip the diplomatic scale. Up until this point, the British had been kind of on the sideline. The South had been trying to get them to join. After the Emancipation Proclamation, they basically weren't going to join the South. But they were still willing to make money. They were selling the Confederacy stuff. there was a proposed sale of 2 large ironclads to be made to the Confederacy. The British will cancel their ship deals with the Confederacy, and they will agree to pay the Union for damages that another ship they had built, the CSS Alabama, had done to American shipping. In other words, diplomatically, what was England now recognizing? Okay, the Union over the Confederacy. There is not going to be any help anymore for the South. Secondly, the Republicans will sweep elections in 1863 in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. What was significant about New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania? They were the centers of those peace movements. Okay? What the Peace Democrats were trying to do is take over government in those states to push for a negotiated peace. The Republicans sweep in all of these elections. Finally, after Grant next captures Chattanooga, Tennessee, Abraham Lincoln has seen enough. He has found his guy. U.S. Grant is not given command of the Army of the Potomac. Grant is given command of all the Union armies, all of them. He is placed at a rank that had not been held in the United States since George Washington. So bring it all together for me. Kind of summarize for me the importance of the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg to the Union. Bring it on home. Finish up the sentence you're writing. You turn to your White House and explain to them the importance.
It's Friday. I didn't really. I forgot from the battle. But yeah, I guess I didn't like
You like to
Like,
do that.
Yeah, they lost like.
What?
No, I know. Confederacy lost it.
All right, so bring it on home. Bring it on home. So, Nick, what do you think?
I said the Battle of Gettysburg and Gettysburg asserted the control of the French of the Union of the Confederates, and with Grant control, they prepared for such forces.
Bella, what do you think?
I said it projected the Union to win the war, and that which it solidified the Union's superiority after this.
Joby, what do you think?
I said that because of the battle, the Union gained most of the support from the nation, and Grant will become the command and will make the Union becoming stronger.
Lincoln's total war strategy was to divide the South by taking the Mississippi River, which they have now done. Next phase was to start marching armies through Georgia and the Carolinas and basically crushing Southern resistance. Grant, who was formerly the general of the West, is going to give that command over to William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman will be charged to march through Georgia. He'll start marching through Georgia, but while he is marching, a guy by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who will later go on to form the Ku Klux Klan, fancied himself to be the new Swamp Fox. He'll start attacking Sherman's forces, attacking his supply train, making it difficult for Sherman to keep his forces fed. Sherman will then capture Atlanta in September of 1864, just ahead of a presidential election. We believe that this capture is going to help ensure Abraham Lincoln winning re-election. That people had started to doubt the war effort until this significant point. Yeah.
So isn't Tecumseh the name of the?
Yes, he is named after him.
Okay. Was there any reason?
Family thing. Anyway, while Atlanta, Georgia, was under the control of Sherman, it is set on fire. Now, Sherman was once asked, "Did you burn Atlanta?" And his answer was, "No, I did not set it on fire. But I certainly didn't do anything to put it out." And while it is under the control of the Union, one of the jewel cities of the South burns to the ground. If you ever see the epic movie Gone with the Wind, the big fire scene in that movie is the burning of is the burning of Atlanta. Sherman will then march from Atlanta to the sea, to Savannah. And Sherman had worked out a solution to his supply train being attacked. He tells his soldiers, we're not going to have a supply train. You are going to find whatever supplies you need. You are going to take whatever is out there, and that is what we are going to use to sustain our army. And basically what will happen is that in this some 250-mile march to the sea, Sherman's army will then fan out to almost 50 miles wide. And they will take anything that is not nailed down, and if it is nailed down, they will destroy it. They start going through this section of Georgia like a swarm of locusts, destroying everything in their path. They burned buildings, they destroyed railways, they took the rails of the railroads, and they would heat up the rails and bend them into bows, just because they could. They basically rattled all the supply lines in this section of the South, and they absolutely destroyed Southern morale. Do not go to Atlanta today and say, I love William Tecumseh Sherman. It will not turn out well for you. This is total war. This is the United States recognizing that the strength of the Confederacy is those who supply the Confederacy. Those who are the providers of food, the providers of weapons. You crush them, you win. This helps change basically the idea of warfare in the world permanently. No longer is it just armies out in the field. But we now target, okay? When we think of winning a war, we now target civilian populations when we bomb the hell out of them. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, total war. The argument is total war shortens war. That if you slam the civilians as well, they're more likely to surrender. Sherman will then seize Savannah, Georgia. What do you think he does to Savannah, Georgia? Absolutely nothing. Here's the idea. I am William Tecumseh Sherman, and I can do whatever the blank I want. I can destroy it if I want. I can keep it if I want. Who is the decider? Who decides what the fate of everything is? William Tecumseh Sherman. Okay? So he takes Savannah. He then sends a message to President Lincoln. Merry Christmas, Mr. President. In the midst of all of this, we are going to have a presidential election. And what the Republicans believed to be the greatest threat to the Union winning the war at this point were Northern Democrats. The fear is that the Democratic Party had a majority of people in it that were against the war. And that should they win the presidency, Congress in 1864, that they could change the course. That they could negotiate a peace. They could end this thing before it was won. But the Democrats were actually split 3 ways. One part, war Democrats, people who wanted to continue the fight. One part, peace Democrats, all we are saying is give peace a chance. And then finally you had a group called the Copperheads. Okay, Copperheads, they don't like emancipation, they don't like people freeing slaves, they believe in white domination, okay? Real pleasant fellows. The Republicans decide to take advantage of this split. They offer a coalition to the war Democrats. They form the Union Party. At the top of the Union Party, since the majority of the Union Party would be the Republicans, they would get to choose who that leader would be. Initially, Salmon Chase, the Treasury Secretary, was trying to kind of backstab Lincoln to get the nomination. But Lincoln fixes him by naming him Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Try and become president? Haha, well, I'll make you Chief Justice. Is that a position you refuse? No, it is not. Another person who people envisioned taking over for Lincoln was Ulysses Grant. But when they offered Grant the nomination, he said, no, I'm a Lincoln man. So, Lincoln it is. But vice president, they're going to offer to the war Democrats. Okay? And in order to bring the war Democrats on board, you've got to give them something. And so what they give them is the vice president. A war Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson is given the vice presidential nomination. Current Vice President Hannibal Hamlin is told, bye-bye now. And now on the ticket is Andrew Johnson. Now the Republicans thought they were genius. This guy was like a poster child for bringing the Union back together. He is the only senator from all of the South that did not secede along with his state. Okay, so yes, I'm a Southerner, but I stayed in the Union. Okay? It seemed genius at the time. It will turn out not to be so genius. The Democrats will run former Union General George G. McClellan. But the party is now kind of split. McClellan, being a former general, can't really voice that he's in favor of ending the war. One section of the party says we want peace. Another section of the party is saying we just want to get rid of anything that has anything to do with Abraham Lincoln, including emancipation. And once Sherman takes Atlanta, it's a done deal. Lincoln for the win. Lincoln will crush McClellan in the Electoral College and win a second term. So now let's bring it on home. Grant, his strategy was to attack all of Lee's forces all at once, making sure he had no army left in reserve to kind of run to the rescue in the middle of a battle. Grant intended to use his numbers as his advantage. He will, throughout 1864, beat Lee in battle after battle. But in doing so, he was basically trading 2 of his soldiers for every 1 soldier that Lee lost. How's this doing as far as his reputation as the butcher? Okay, it's making him seem more that way. But also, how is it going for his reputation as the winner? That one's going too. The final thing before you make your decision as to which group you would join, Lee is actually losing a larger percentage of his army. If you're looking at the casualty rate, or the percentage of your soldiers that are dying, Lee is losing a greater number. And here's the thing about Lee's army. They are irreplaceable. He does not have people he can now put back into the army to fill it back up again. Grant does. So with his manpower reduced, Lee decides that he is going to put himself in a defensive position around Richmond. But he has a plan. His plan is to, in effect, once Grant basically gets into a position to take Richmond, he'll in effect give Grant Richmond. And while Grant is taking Richmond, Lee will take his army south and join up with what was left of the Confederate Southern Army under Joe Johnston. Lee's theory is the same as is the same as George Washington's. George Washington believed he could not lose the American Revolution as long as he had an army in the field. As long as his army was out there, he could not lose. So Lee thinks, I'm the new George Washington. If my army stays out there, I can't lose. So he thinks he has it all figured out. He would basically set up Grant to take Richmond, then he would run. Well, Grant takes Richmond, but blocks all the exits. Grant takes Richmond, but Lee can't get out. Now, the taking of Richmond is going to give us one of the more amazing moments of the Civil War. You see, Abraham Lincoln is going to be contacted. He's going to be told that we've taken Richmond. And Lincoln is going to insist to go down to Richmond and see this for himself. And so he steamboats down there, okay? A couple of sailors will bring him, okay, and his little son, okay, to the streets of Richmond. And there was Abraham Lincoln with his son walking through the streets of Richmond looking at kind of the remains. You see, the Confederates had burned down a lot of it as they had retreated, as they had gotten out. And so there's this smoldering wreckage of a city. But then emerging from the smoldering wreckage of the city are all the people that were now free because of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so there is Abraham Lincoln basically surrounded by huge crowds of African American, now free people, freedmen. And if there is a moment that is basically the symbolic picture of what the Emancipation Proclamation was, it was that moment. Lee found that he could not escape. He holds a meeting of his top generals, basically saying, I cannot get the army out of here. What do y'all think I should do? The answer proposed to General Lee was that we take our uniform markings off our uniforms, we run into the hills, and we become a guerrilla army. Force the Union to hunt us down. If the Confederacy had done that, it probably would have taken maybe years to successfully crush this former army. But Lee says that would be dishonorable, and he refuses to go along with the plan. And so he writes Grant a note. What if somebody were thinking of surrender? Grant claims in his diary that he had the most massive migraine headache that day, that he was trying to figure out what Lee's next move was going to be. He couldn't picture it. It was driving him nuts. He gets the note. The two finally exchange a couple of other letters and decide to meet in a little town called Appomattox Courthouse. Okay? Appomattox Courthouse. It's the name of the town. They meet in a private home in which Grant shows up in front of this house in a muddy uniform, all rumpled looking, and he and his team go to one side of a room. Lee shows up gorgeous, okay, feathers in his hat, bright sword, shined boots, and he and his team go to the other side of the room. And they send messages back and forth across the room. Okay? It had to be in writing. Finally, Grant, who had that reputation of unconditional surrender, will offer what could best be described as gentlemanly terms. That basically, Lee, okay, just stack up your rifles. You can take any personal arms with you, your horses, and go home. This is in effect the end of the Civil War. Technically, it goes on for another couple months as Joe Johnston's army is still in the South. There was still an army out in Texas to be defeated. But without Lee super genius, the South is done. Yeah?
So why couldn't Lee just go and join them in the other?
Because that is what, would that be the proper thing to do once you surrender?
No, but
No, you don't. These were some of the things people like. This is a little bit different than today. Once you sign a piece of paper that says you're done, you're done. Abraham Lincoln did not get to enjoy this victory very long. you see, there was a conspiracy afoot. A group had come up with a scheme on how they could destabilize the American government, okay, and give the South a chance to rise again. This group included Southern sympathizers, one guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth, another guy by the name of Lewis Powell, another guy by the name of George Axelrod, and several others. The scheme that they come up with, triple murder. That at 10:15 p.m. on a given night, they would assassinate simultaneously the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, and the Secretary of State. One of these would-be assassins was a guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor and a fanboy of William Shakespeare, particularly the play Julius Caesar. In Julius Caesar, one of the things that Shakespeare basically kind of puts out there, that Mark Antony, with a great, eloquent kind of defense of Caesar, basically turned Caesar into a martyr. In Booth's opinion, Abraham Lincoln's now good friend, William Seward, could possibly serve as a Mark Antony, and so he had to die. So, after having met with his cabinet and restating that his policy now, as the war was coming to an end, was to bring the nation together, to heal the nation's wounds, to bind up our nation's wounds, to bring us a just and lasting peace. Okay? Abraham Lincoln would then prepare to go to the theater. He was going to see a play, Our American Cousin, which going to the theater was one of the few things that he really got to enjoy. And all of the stuff that happens during the Civil War, the one time he gets to not be Abraham Lincoln president, is when he was watching theater. So now, 10:15 p.m. Scene 1. The Vice President's lodgings at a hotel. The assassin-to-be, George Axelrod. George Axelrod had been steeling himself, getting himself ready to assassinate the Vice President by basically drinking all day. At 10:15 p.m., at the appointed time, he gets to Vice President Johnson's door, and he knocks. He then gets cold feet and walks away. (10:15 p.m., scene 2. The home of William Seward. Now Seward, okay, had been in a carriage accident the week before. He's recovering from great injuries, including a broken jaw. Okay. He's in bed under the watchful eye of his family. Lewis Powell knocks on the door of the Secretary of State's house, claiming to be sent by a doctor. He had medicine that needed to be administered to the Secretary of State immediately. Now the guy who opened up the door, okay, sees this immaculately dressed, huge guy, okay, saying he needs to see the Secretary of State, basically kind of gets pushed to the side, letting Lewis Powell in. But Secretary of State Seward's son, Fred, had kind of heard something going on downstairs. and he was walking down the stairs as Lewis Powell was walking up. Fred Seward tells Lewis Powell, you cannot go up to see my father. He is sleeping. If you have medicine, I will administer it to him. Just give it to me. And Lewis Powell acts as if he is about to leave, and then suddenly turns back around carrying a Navy revolver, which he tries to fire at Fred Seward, but it misfires. He then flips the gun over, runs at Fred Seward, bashes him on the head, basically partially exposing his brain, and then moves upstairs towards Secretary of State Seward's room. He bursts into Secretary of State Seward's room, and there was an Army private that was watching over him. And the Army private lunges at Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell takes out a Bowie knife and slashes him across the forehead. He then goes toward Secretary of State Seward, whose daughter Fanny is standing in between. He pushes Fanny Seward to the side. He then takes his knife and slices it down at Secretary of State Seward's neck. But there was a metal contraption on his jaw that was meant to hold the jaw into place in order for it to heal. So instead of hitting his neck, the knife slices at Secretary of State Seward's cheek. It gushes out blood. At this point, another soldier and another one of Seward's sons, Gus, rush in at Lewis Powell. He slices them at them with his knife and then starts running down the stairs. There was then a State Department messenger between him and the door, so he slices him and gets out. Okay? All right? Okay, this guy's massively big with a knife, okay? All right? A Bowie knife is about a blade about that long. It's pretty nasty. Anyway, scene 3. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. He's well known at Ford Theater, where Our American Cousin was playing. He simply rides up to the theater, pays some kid a couple bucks to watch his horse. He then goes up into the theater. He walks to the president's personal box, presents his card. John Wilkes Booth. The guard at the door simply lets him in. He walks into the booth, big box. He has a Derringer pistol. He brings it up to the back of President Lincoln's head and fires. At that point, Major Rathbone, who along with his date had been accompanying the president to the theater that evening, turns to see Booth and tries to now grab him. Booth now takes out a knife and slashes these people knives, okay, at Major Rathbone. Booth, who has a flair for drama, being an actor, is then going to make a leap, okay, all right, from the presidential box to the stage below. Now, actors back then did their own stunts, so you would normally know how to land here. But his spurs get caught on the American flag. And he lands awkwardly on the stage, breaking his leg. He still manages to get out to his horse. He rides off into the night. But later, he will be captured and killed. Lincoln is assassinated. Yes?
Is Lewis Powell caught?
Yeah, they all get caught.
Okay. Oh, so.
Including the doctor that sets
Busted.
John Wilkes Booth's leg. It was Dr. Mudd. You may have heard the phrase, "Thy name is Mudd," and you think that it has to do with mud being dirty. It's about, your name is tainted if your name is Mudd, because Dr. Mudd. Yeah.
Dr. Mudd is like my great,
Ah.
a lot of great uncles.
So which team are you on? The unwitting setter of John Wilkes Booth's leg, or somebody in on the conspiracy as convicted? The evidence against Mudd mainly is that where Mudd was living was so far off the beaten path that you had to know where you were going to get there. Anyway, Lincoln died at the pinnacle of his fame. And when Grant hears about Lincoln's assassination, he will say, "The president was inclined to be kind and magnanimous, and his death at this time is an irreparable loss to the South, which now needs so much both his tenderness and his magnanimity." You see, Abraham Lincoln had said, it is time for us to bind up our nation's wounds. It is time for a just and lasting peace. But here's the thing. This has been a nasty 4-year war. How many people in America, with the United States winning, was going to basically turn to the South and say, give him a hug? Most people in the North are saying, crush him, kill them, destroy them, right? One of the only people who could get away with, hey, we got to just bring this back in. We've got to rebuild the country, is Lincoln. And now he's gone.
So, had they killed U.S. Grant, do they think, like, was that technically like the real Antony in the situation?
Possible. So as you take a look at this question, earlier when we talked about Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass, I told you that Whitman wrote my favorite poem. And so now, if you know the movie, it can only be done this way.
Oh, yay.
Okay. Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting. Will follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. Oh Captain, rise up, hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung. For you the bugle trills, for you the bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you the shores are crowding. For you they call the swaying mast, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. His alto shores and ringo bells, but I with mournful tread walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. So, without any sort of bathos, encouragement as to one opinion or another, evaluate to what extent Abraham Lincoln was effective as president. Sure. Any way you want. It's up to Ms. Christopher and whether she wants to play. Yes, sir. Okay, so we'll just, we can stop. And we now shift to fixing this whole thing. So the unit is called The Causes and the Results of the American Civil War. The results, the bringing everything back together thing, we call Reconstruction. And one of the problems of Reconstruction is that the Constitution did not address the question on how seceded states are to be readmitted to the Union. I mean, those guys who wrote the Constitution, they came up with a lot of great things, a lot of scenarios, right? But states leaving the Union and then wanting to come back, or being forced to come back, they did not cover. And why this is important is because of basically who's in charge. To initially admit a state, Congress kind of has the thing. They vote to whether or not a state gets admitted. This is what had caused issues that had led to the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850. All of these had been about admitting states. Does Congress have the call as to whether or not states get to come back? Or, as Abraham Lincoln would argue, they never left. Remember that that's the basis for the Emancipation Proclamation, that they are simply states in the state of rebellion. And so if they never really left, can you make it that difficult for them to come back? Okay, so in effect, this is your struggle. This is your argument. This argument would have been hard enough had Abraham Lincoln lived. But now, it's this war Democrat Southerner, Johnson, who's president, versus Congress. Now we do know what Abraham Lincoln wanted. Because in 1863, he made a speech regarding the readmittance of Louisiana. What he is going to say is that that since the South did not legally leave the Union, it should be pretty easy for them to come back. And he is going to basically offer amnesty and a pardon to anyone who is going to take an oath of allegiance to the United States and anyone who pledged to abide by emancipation. So you can be low-down rebel scum, okay? You can be people who said, I hate the Union, but now all you have to do is say, love it, Union! Emancipation is all right by me. Pardoned. Amnesty. You cannot be convicted of any sort of rebel crime. You are pardoned for any past sins. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Lincoln then next said that once you got 10% of a population of a state that did this, these people could then reestablish a state government. You are once again part of the United States of America. This goes into the theme that Abraham Lincoln had, bind up our nation's wounds, okay, in just and lasting peace. But even while Abraham Lincoln is alive, there is going to be a conflict over this point. Congress said, way too easy. These people have been shooting at us. 10%? Are you kidding me? And so Congress is going to attempt to increase the restrictions in 1864 with what is known as the Wade-Davis Bill, not to be confused with that player who was on Kansas City. Wade-Davis. They believed that the only people who should be allowed to actually create a government would be people who had not actually fought against the Union. So no Union soldiers, no one who served in the government of a Confederate state, no one who served in the Confederate government, because all of those people, you could say, had fought against the Union. It would have to be people who were outside that group that would have any sort of way of doing this. They also increased the oath thing up to 50% from 10. Lincoln, Lincoln, used a very special maneuver to veto this bill. It was called a pocket veto. A pocket veto is simply this. Whenever a bill is passed, the president is supposed to be given 10 days to sign or veto a bill. If he does not sign or veto a bill, it becomes a law without his signature. But if he is not given 10 days, if he doesn't take any action, the bill disappears. The joke is, it's like the president shoved it in his pocket. Congress passes this bill and then adjourns. They don't give him the 10 days. So Lincoln's inaction makes the bill disappear. But Lincoln realizes that this is a divide and immediately opens talks on compromise. How can we work this out? This had still not been settled when he is assassinated. Does that make sense? We still don't know how this whole thing would have worked out. With Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson becomes president. And Andrew Johnson is way different than Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Johnson was a poor guy from Tennessee. Basically, you look at people who became president of the United States, they're all basically kind of rich guys, except for perhaps Martin Van Buren, and then Abraham Lincoln, okay, dirt poor, and then even dirt poorer than Abraham Lincoln was Andrew Johnson. He was apprenticed to a tailor. No real schooling. He worked his way up through Tennessee politics as an impassioned champion of the poor against the rich planters. That's how he got elected senator. He got chosen to be the running mate because he was the only Southern senator who had not seceded with his state. But his other beliefs, states' rights, he's a Democrat. And so here, at the head of a government that had basically done this huge total war effort, total centralification of American government, is Mr. States' Rights. A Southerner. And a racist. Johnson will enact a plan Johnson will enact a plan to reconstruct the South after Congress had adjourned. In his plan, he would disenfranchise top Confederates, but they could gain back their ability to vote and serve by getting a personal pardon from him. Southern states would then have to repeal their Articles of Secession, repudiate any debts that they owed as a confederacy, and ratify the 13th Amendment. Johnson. Johnson is considered to be soft on the South. So, I'm going to let everybody play catch up here because I feel I jumped into this part. This was kind of the view of Johnson as far as dealing with southern states during Reconstruction. As Johnson making a deal with like this devil guy, did you know that the devil wears a CSA, Confederate States of America backpack? So, In closing today, what a good place to, as a transition would be, is that Lincoln, we don't know. We don't know whether his bind up the nation's wounds plan would have worked. Most opinions is that it was an extraordinarily difficult course of action. It would be a very difficult thing to do to bring the nation back together, where you had these radical Republicans that wanted to punish the South, and you had a South that was still absolutely defiant on the issue of slavery. And bringing those two sides together was going to be extraordinarily difficult. But we don't know if Abraham Lincoln could have pulled it off because of the assassination. What we do know is that Johnson comes in as a Southerner, and he will kind of attempt to pick up where Abraham Lincoln left off, being kind of soft on the South. But how does it look when a Southerner is soft on the South? Is it the same as Abraham Lincoln, the guy who won the Civil War, being soft on the South? And what the immediate result is going to be, the one thing that I want you to get down, is that Johnson will recognize a whole bunch of Southern states back into the Union. And they will pass a series of laws that were known as the Black Codes. When next we meet, we will see what these Black Codes were, and we will see the success, the failure, the whatnot of Andrew Johnson.